For more than 80 years, the 8th Air Force has regularly celebrated their magnificent heritage, as well as honoring the heroes that gave their lives in its service. But the first steps towards establishing America's most famous bombing group took place nearly 27 years before its formation in the shadow of the Great War. The United States didn't enter World War I until 1917, but the need for a strong military air power became a major focus 2 years before that, when it was established that America could no longer tolerate its merchant shipping losses at the hands of Germany and its allies.
The War Department opened bids for a heavier-than-air flying machine. Signal Corps specifications required that it carry 2 persons a distance of 125 miles at an average speed of 40 miles an hour. The Wright signed a stiff contract. Finally, at Fort Myer, Virginia, they flew a machine that was accepted as U.S. Army Airplane number 1.
By 1913, 41 Army pilots were decorated with these gold military aviator wings. Among them was Lieutenant Henry Arnold, who later, as commanding general of the AAF, led 2.5 million airmen to victory. Another aviation pioneer, Glenn Curtiss, also built early Army trainers. Soon, more inventors improved the machine with tractor instead of pusher propellers, and the Army began to see the new airplane emerge as a weapon.
By 1916, our only trained aviators were a few Americans flying with France, and they made us proud. They were the famous Lafayette Escadrille, started by Norman Prince, William Thaw, Victor Chapman, and Bert Hall, who courageously fought when Germany had full control of the sky over Europe. When German U-boats forced us to declare war, American air power ranked 14th.
Believe me, we were far from ready. I was a rookie cadet, I ought to know. They gave us wooden guns and told us we were going to turn the tide. You know, in a couple of weeks, we began to look as though we might do it. For training equipment, we molded our own bombs out of plaster. Pretty soon, we trained with the real things, Lewis machine guns. Having met the requirements, we were issued leather flying togs and helmets. Assignments were made. We got a chance to fly. First, we made a pre-flight check of the baling wire planes. Then we tried our wings. "50 hours in the air, a few bombs. We were checked out."
Late in 1917, France met the AEF's first Aero Squadron, commanded by Major Ralph Royce. His outfit was the first to see action, and they proudly pasted paper iron crosses over enemy bullet holes.
Our commander was Colonel Billy Mitchell. America's first flyers were there. General Benjamin Falloy in command of supply and schools. Colonel Thomas Milling, head of Air Service Units, 1st Army. And Colonel Frank Lahm for the 2nd Army, commanded by General Bullard.
When Major William Thaw and the Lafayette Escadrille became the 103rd Aero Squadron, they brought a record of triumphs. Thaw, 5 German planes down. Lieutenant Larner, 3. Lieutenant Merrick, 1. Lieutenant Tobin, 3.
Don't forget the aces. Captain Field Kindley with 12 victories, and Major Raoul Lufberry with 17, before they were both grounded forever. Then those who lived to take part in another war, Captain Elliot Springs with a score of 12, and the ace of aces, hat of the ring Captain Eddie Rickenbacker with 26 victories.
The boys still talk about the big push. When we lifted the flaps that September morning in 1918, everything was ready. Billy Mitchell had asked for every Allied airplane that could fight, and we brought them out. The brass ordered a tremendous air force to control the skies over the Samahil sector. This was the 1st Army's field of battle. For the dawn takeoffs, we put flares on our wingtips. Every Allied field on the continent gave its planes. General Mitchell called for 1,500. We actually got 1,481 off the ground. Wooden props spit into the air and the engines began to rev up. Our mission was to protect the doughboys of the First Army. Some had orders to bomb and strafe enemy installations, others to engage the Germans in the air. This was it.
Each pilot had been carefully briefed for his part in the mission. U.S. aviators in 609 American planes, now a solid part of Allied air power, rose to attack. We overwhelmed their air defense, winning and holding air superiority. It was almost the same a few weeks later in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, where we bombed with telling effect in the most notable aerial effort of the war. November 11, 1918, closed a chapter in the unending story of the United States Air Force.
Among the honored Army Air Force pilots to serve in the Army Air Corps during the Great War was a certain pilot officer named James Harold Doolittle. He was to become a key figure in the legend of the mighty Eighth.
In the early 20s, chief proponent for the value of air power was Brigadier General Mitchell. Since his return from France, he had insisted that an airplane could sink any surface ship. And when he argued that 1/2 the cost of a single new battle wagon could supply the planes to make the warship obsolete, Congress insisted he get the chance to prove it. For the tests, Billy Mitchell hastily assembled a force including some Navy flyers which he trained at Langley Field, Virginia. He taught them the same bombing techniques which he had learned in World War I. Engines were started, and the 1st Provisional Air Brigade took off for a mission which was to test the future of military aviation. Fast pursuits and heavy bombers, accompanied by auxiliary planes with cameras and observers, headed for the latest target, a U.S. battleship. By new tests conducted on the obsolete Alabama, Mitchell tried to clinch his claims. Through the use of phosphorus bombs, he demonstrated the fine art of precision bombing. A perfect hit. This was expert pinpoint bombing. Heavier bombs were now prepared by the armorers of the Air Brigade, and the SS Chalmette radioed orders for the new takeoffs. Tower men signaled the heavy bombers, and again they displayed the same remarkable precision. But the Joint Board was still unconvinced even when more bombs finally sank the Alabama.
2 years later, Billy Mitchell and his men prepared for a new series of battleship bombing tests, this time against the obsolete battle wagons, New Jersey and Virginia. On the deck of the Sam Mihiel were General Pershing, Admiral Shoemaker, Assistant Secretary of War Davis, and the new Air Chief, General Patrick. The 1923 tests attracted even more widespread public and official attention.
The target sat and waited for a 2,000-pound bomb to be dropped from 10,000 feet. The Air Service was learning that a near miss was the body blow that weakened the hull, setting up a target for the knockout punch. Mitchell's Air Brigade was becoming more and more expert and could lay those eggs anywhere. A photo plane recorded everything on film. The beginning of the end of a mighty warship victim of precision bombing.
The 30s also began to see a change in Army aircraft design. Sleek monoplanes, all metal construction. General Falloy had urged the aviation industry to compete in the building of a fast bomber. And Boeing delivered the 163-mile-an-hour B-9. The same year, Boeing took a powerful 600-horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine and strapped on a rugged 24-foot saddle. They called the result a P-26. These first all-metal pursuit monoplanes were still on hand 9 years later when the Philippine Air Force tried to use them against the Japs. Pitted against the B-9, the Boeing fighter and bomber put each other through their paces. Kicking up a top speed of 230 miles an hour, it easily outstripped the B-9 bomber and many other planes of the period. Another entry in the bomber competition was Martin's early version of the B-10, also a twin-engine, all-metal monoplane. It had a waist gun, a nose gun, and an efficient bomb bay which could close on a 2,000-pound argument. This armament, plus a 1,300-mile range, made it the most powerful bomber of the time, while its speed of 207 miles an hour made it the fastest in the world.
An excellent trial for the new B-10s came in 1934 when Lieutenant Colonel Hap Arnold and Majors Hugh Nur and Ralph Royce led 27 officers and men on a long-range test flight. Takeoff, Washington, D.C. Destination, Fairbanks, Alaska. Mission, to fly over extensive Alaskan territory, photograph strategic landing areas, determine the feasibility of sending an Air Force to Alaska in an emergency, and report on frontier defense. On the return trip from Juneau to Seattle, the crews flew non-stop through fog and rainstorms, 990 miles. Thus, as early as 1934, the Air Corps proved that it was technically possible for an enemy to bomb the United States from the Arctic. After reaching Washington, the Alaskan flyers were honored at Bowling Field.
Other totalitarian nations like Italy were also testing their air forces in actual war on a scale unknown since 1918. Her soldiers and airmen were led into an unwarranted campaign of aggression against her helpless neighbor, Ethiopia, by Premier Benito Mussolini, an accomplished public rabble-rouser.
That's when the American press started wondering why U.S. air power was falling so far behind Italy, France, Russia, and Britain. As a correspondent, I went to the War Department. Air Corps leaders showed me what they were doing with limited funds. I was surprised to find that working with American industry, the generals had started planning a long-range heavy bomber as early as 1933. Specifications had asked for an aerial dreadnought of tremendous capabilities. These requirements of speed, range, load, and ceiling had posed many problems for the designers. I discovered that among the models submitted was this revolutionary design from Boeing calling for 4 engines. If accepted, it would become a flying battleship, 68 feet long with a wingspan of 104 feet. Along with the model, Boeing engineers had prepared a detailed proposal which they submitted to the Materiel Division. Then I learned that in June 1934, Boeing received a contract from the Army for design data, a full-scale wooden mock-up, and complete wind tunnel tests on their proposal. Later, with many changes and suggestions, the Army Inspection Board approved construction of only one experimental plane. But so great was Boeing's faith in their idea, they borrowed money and staked their future on building the single B-17. Because this airplane was being constructed in competition, there was no financial support from the government. Instead, there is considerable skepticism and opposition. Therefore, it was strictly a pioneering venture, even to the wooden scaffolding and the custom-made parts and instruments. Building the first 4-engine bomber was a great gamble. No one would have thought that this maze of metal taking shape in the Boeing plant was to become one of the major weapons to fight for freedom a few years later. June 1935. The men who built her rolled the baby out into the sun. She looked magnificent. So good, they called her a flying fortress, and the name stuck. If she worked, the XB-17 would be the biggest single step toward advancement of American air power. Now, would the Army Air Corps accept her? The Giant was groomed and readied for a back-breaking test. At Seattle, the XB-17 pointed its sharp nose to the east and with a great surge of power soared into the air. Past Mount Rainier, the majestically sweeping design with feather-like maneuverability surpassed even the best hopes of its designers. The bomber flew the record-shattering 2,100 miles non-stop in exactly 9 hours at an average speed of 232 miles an hour. The basic Air Corps specifications were met as the plane came to rest at Wright Field, Ohio. For 2 months, Air Corps engineers tested the B-17. Few other planes were equally important in air history. Then came the day of the big test. October 30, 1935. And before the very eyes of the Army brass who had come to decide on it, high hopes were shaken.
Every one of us who had worked for the perfect defense weapon saw our creation go up in smoke. But Air Corps Chief General Westover immediately took up the battle. After several months of investigations, the plane was cleared of any mechanical fault. The B-17 could not be ignored because of an accident. More of these 4-engine bombers had to be built. Men and machines went back to work, and American air power marched on. Machinists, metal workers, small parts men, the skilled hands of America's great industrial wealth were back at their benches, performing millions of precision aviation tasks. A contract for construction of a service test fleet of 13 airplanes had been awarded the Boeing Company by far-sighted leaders of the Air Corps. Although this contract was completed with horse and buggy production methods, the dreams of men like Generals Westover and Andrews were being fulfilled. They claimed the airplane had brought into being a different mode of warfare, the application of air power. And with a B-17, they hoped to give America the weapon which could engage any enemy on land, sea, and in the air, destroy his war production and will to fight. However, it wasn't until spring 1937 that this new air power began to arrive, when the first B-17s were delivered to the 2nd Bomb Group.
The Air Corps was finally being equipped with weapons equal to any military planes in design, speed, endurance. Meanwhile, with the advent of Hitler, the German Air Force came back to life. Glider clubs for Hitler youths were fostered throughout the fatherland. For the bigger boys, flying sports clubs were the attraction. First, Germany's aviation industry was ordered to build only commercial planes, easily convertible for military purposes. Then, ignoring the Versailles Treaty, Hitler gave Air Minister Goering the green light to go into mass production of fighters and bombers. America, the cradle of aviation, soon was outmanned and outplaned. We didn't seem to know that it took 1 year to train a pilot and 5 years to design and build a plane. Hermann Goering did. Hitler now had a powerful political weapon, and waxing Nazi aggressive ambition put it to use. Mechanized forces with 400 aircraft began to cross the Austrian border on March 11, 1938. Hitler himself followed the next day and formally swallowed up the Republic of Austria and its small air force, prelude to World War II.
On 1st of September 1939, Hitler's Nazi forces invaded Poland, and Europe was once again plunged into the furnace of war. The Nazis' Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, quickly saw European countries crushed one by one under the might of Hitler's illegally built military might as the stain of the Third Reich spread across the continent.
It finally took world events to give the U.S. Air Force its biggest shot in the arm. On the fateful dawn of September 1st, 1939, Hitler directed the German Army and Luftwaffe in a lightning-like campaign. The map was Poland. The plan was surprise. 20 years before, President Wilson had warned us that any future war will inevitably open with great aerial activity. Wilson was right. Without warning, 2,000 modern German combat planes took off for the first aerial blitz in the history of the world. Poland died on its airfield. With this earth-shattering overture played by strafing Stuka bombers, World War II began. Ironically, the method the Germans followed in this Polish campaign was the same one by which we, on a far larger scale, would defeat Germany. As thousands of bombs demolished Polish cities, the U.S. Air Corps learned a lesson. Now Hitler's threat, today Germany, tomorrow the world, was both believed and feared.
In the meantime, the United States began to prepare for war on the land, on the sea, and in the air. And having seen for the first time the ominous power wielded by Hitler's Luftwaffe, America began to shape the tools and methods with which the 8th Air Force would fight Nazi Germany. And then, on the 7th of December 1941, the entire dimension of World War II changed in the space of just 75 minutes. Japan went to war with the United States by carrying out their infamous surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, in which a crippling blow decimated the American fleet anchored there.
Wave after wave of enemy planes bombed American aircraft and units of the Pacific Fleet in a treacherous attack which achieved perfect tactical surprise.
At the end of the single air attack, the United States had suffered a crushing blow, and the nation was at war.
President Roosevelt championed the nation in its desire to strike back at the heart of the Empire of Japan, stating, "An attack on the Japanese homeland would cause confusion in the minds of the Japanese people and sow doubt about the reliability of their leaders. Americans badly need a morale boost." But it was not until April of 1942, after the formation of the 8th Air Force, that an attack against the Japanese capital Tokyo was possible. The Doolittle raid was the means to this end. World War I pilot officer James Harold Doolittle was now World War II Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, and he was chosen to lead this daring raid to which his name was given. The volunteer crews, the most experienced medium bomber crews in the Army Air Force, came from the 17th Bombardment Group, which was attached to the 8th Air Force. And they, together with their B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, became the very first daring and audacious bombing mission undertaken by the 8th Air Force.
Packed on the afterdeck of the Hornet are 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers. Never before have these huge planes been launched from a carrier. High explosive and demolition bombs are made ready for the destruction of military objectives in Japan. Colonel, now Major General Doolittle, with Captain Mark Mitcher, commander of the aircraft carrier Hornet, who was once decorated by Japan, now gives his medal to be returned to the Japs on the tail of a bomb. Not until they are miles at sea do these men know definitely the mission for which they have volunteered. Now their thoughts go back to their months of careful preparation, clothed in the greatest secrecy. Only Colonel Doolittle knew that Japan was to be their target. Now they realize that the miniature cities laid out for practice bombing near an American airfield duplicated military objectives: Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. Even the strategy of flying in low over targets is an important part of the training for the greatest surprise raid in the history of aerial warfare. Not even certain they can take off successfully from a carrier that was never designed for launching Army bombing planes. Closer and closer they approach enemy-controlled waters and the danger of discovery. Jimmy Doolittle and Captain Mitcher discuss every detail of the carrier takeoff. Suddenly, a strange vessel is sighted. It's a Jap patrol boat, and the task force intends to destroy it before a warning can be radioed to Japan. Lifeboat goes to pick up Jap survivors. It is feared they have flashed the news to heavy Jap naval forces in the vicinity. Survivors are picked up and brought aboard. Jimmy Doolittle asks Admiral Halsey to go in closer for another hour and a half. And now the signal is flashed for the takeoff, 10 hours ahead of schedule. The added distance to be flown increases the hazards. There is no hesitation. They man their planes. Doolittle pilots the lead plane. There's a breathless moment as the big bomber gathers speed. It's airborne. The first Army bomber ever to be launched from a carrier is safely in the air. Now they know it can be done, and they time their takeoff with the upsurge of the bow of the carrier in the heavy seas. Next to go. Nose wheel lifted and wing flaps down for maximum lift and the quickest possible takeoff. Another B-25 to join the formation circling over the task force until all the 16 planes can get into the air. Tokyo ahead. Here is America's answer to treachery. Secret Norden bomb sights have been removed from these planes and replaced by a makeshift device costing about 20 cents. These historic pictures round out the electrifying news of Tokyo's first taste of American vengeance in April 1942. Loaded with eggs of destruction, they wing through a fog-ridden dawn. One of the last planes to go almost meets disaster on the takeoff from the rolling and pitching deck of the carrier. It drops dangerously, but good piloting saves it. The planes sweep in without being discovered. They separate into groups to attack the several objectives carefully selected by means of accurate intelligence to ensure that only targets of military value will be hit. Colonel Doolittle himself has told of flying over the Emperor's palace and refraining from bombing it, though he could have left it in ruins. Here are the last pictures to come out of Tokyo before Pearl Harbor. They show the Japs rehearsing with all the realism possible for air raids, which they assured the Emperor and people of Japan would never be experienced. The defense system, as they practice it here, proves disorganized and panic-stricken when Doolittle and his men catch them flat-footed. Not a single shell fragment hit a plane. The loss of face by Tokyo may well have driven the Japs into the disastrous Midway expedition and its staggering losses of ships and men. This Jap-made scene of Tokyo swept by fire following an earthquake shows clearly what must have happened in the many areas hit by the hundreds of incendiary bombs. Later in China, the flyers who bailed out safely are decorated by Madame Chiang Kai-shek. The smiling Jimmy Doolittle does not yet know the fate of some of his comrades. All survivors, except the crew of one plane which landed safely in Russia and were interned, reach America and are decorated by General Arnold, head of the American Army Air Forces. Doolittle wins the Congressional Medal of Honor. Mark these men well. General Tojo and his barbarous war bandits, who boasted they had executed some of the flyers captured. General Arnold replies to this brutal news with fighting words.
Those men died as heroes. We must not rest. We must redouble our efforts until the inhuman warlords who committed this crime have been utterly destroyed.
Tokyo Raiders, Captain Watson, Wright, and Lawson left, tell of targets bombed and vengeance to come.
Our takeoff from the Hornet was made successfully. It wasn't as much the length of takeoff that bothered us, it was the width. It was about a 4-foot clearance between the right wingtip and the island, the left wingtip hanging over the deck on the left-hand side. Trip in was uneventful. My first target was a tank factory in the south of Tokyo. My alternative targets being an oil storage tank and a railroad yard. We were fortunate in getting through the anti-aircraft and reaching our number one target. Dropped the entire load on this tank factory and had the satisfaction of seeing 2 of the bombs score direct hits.
Captain Lawson speaks for his comrades.
We all feel pretty strongly about these boys that we were with. We had all been pretty close. Large family, almost like brothers. We'd known each other from a year to a year and a half before this raid ever came off. We knew their families, their children, and if there's any way to get even, we'll certainly try.
On the 28th of January 1942, 3 months before the Doolittle raid, the U.S. Army Air Forces activated the 8th Air Force at Savannah, Georgia. It was made up of the 8th Bomber Command, the 8th Fighter Command, and the 8th Ground Air Services Command. On the 23rd of February 1942, the 8th Bomber Command moved to England, where it established its wartime headquarters in the Wickham Abbey School for Girls. Subsequently, the men that were to become the mighty 8th began their long journey to the new front.
June 1942, New York Harbor. Men of the 8th Air Force, 10,000 strong, prepared to board a single converted luxury liner for England, just as their fathers did a generation before in the AEF Aero Squadrons. This time, the 97th Bomb Group ground crews, 2 fighter groups and their service units were embarking for England. On her maiden troop ship run across the Atlantic, the Queen Elizabeth carried the vanguard of American air power for the new fight against aggression.
In England, at High Wycombe, we used a girls' boarding school as headquarters. Here, 30 miles from Piccadilly, began the build-up, which eventually made the 8th Air Force larger than the entire U.S. Army had been only 3 years before. As the summer of 1942 rushed by, the work of Generals Duncan, Akers, Spots, and the rest of us made the idea a reality.
After months of preparation, the first combat group of the 8th Bomber Command to arrive in the United Kingdom was the ground echelon of the 97th Bombardment Group. They launched their first raid in northwestern Europe on the 4th of July. With just 6 Douglas A-20 Havocs and 6 Douglas Bostons, all medium bombers. They attacked 4 airfields in the Netherlands, with Captain Charles C. Kegelman bringing his damaged bomber home to receive the Distinguished Service Cross from General Spaatz on 11th of July. This was the first DSC, or Distinguished Service Cross, earned by a member of the 8th Air Force in World War II, but it was by no means the last. Over the course of the next 5 weeks, the United States Army Air Force established a strategic air force in the British Isles with a mission to attack Germany's war effort behind the front lines. To facilitate this daring endeavor, a new breed of heavy bomber began arriving in England, the iconic Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress.
American-made bombs at an American aerodrome somewhere in England, loading up for a raid on Nazi-held France. American flying fortresses, manned by Americans, serving notice on Adolf Hitler that they are here to fight. Operating as a complete striking force, the Americans bring their own pilots and combat crews, mechanics and ground men, calmly, efficiently checking every part of the giant ships. 3,000 miles from home, and the Yankee sense of humor still with them. Every machine gun and cannon is tested before the flight. Now the crews assemble. Arriving on bicycles, they report to headquarters for final orders. Men from across the sea who have come to aid their brothers in arms, those gallant flyers of the RAF. It's the hour for which they've been waiting. Every face is tense as the operations chief issues secret coded instructions for combat. Outlines the raid, its objectives, what every man and every plane must do. Officers and men ready for action. Scenes duplicated day after day as the United States Army Air Force unleashes its squadrons against the Nazis. Well-loaded scout cars, the familiar American Jeep, haul them to the points of takeoff.
Regular 8th Bomber Group combat operations began on the 17th of August 1942, when the 97th Bombardment Group flew 12 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses, attacking the Rouen-Sauteville marshalling yards in France. Colonel Frank A. Armstrong, commander of the 97th Bomb Group, sat in the co-pilot's seat of the lead B-17. The pilot in command and the leader of this historic mission was Paul Tibbets. Tibbets was already a legend in the flying community and by reputation was the best flyer in the Army Air Force. Later that year, in the lead-up to Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, he was chosen to fly Supreme Allied Commander Lieutenant General Dwight D. Eisenhower to his headquarters in Gibraltar, a mission during which he successfully defended against enemy attacks, delivering Eisenhower safely. If he had not done so, World War II could have had a completely different outcome. All Allied eyes were on the 8th Air Force that day in the summer of '42, as the first steps in proving the effectiveness of daylight bombing began in earnest.
Our first test in tactics came August 17th. It was a critical day for the 8th Bomber Command when we loaded up for the first U.S. raid from England in U.S. planes in daylight. General Ira Aker had told us that the target was the great marshalling yard near Rouen in Nazi-occupied France. There were still plenty of skeptics who predicted dismal results from the first attempt at a daylight mission. Generals Spots and Aker had to prove them wrong. Our morale had worn pretty thin from repeated dry runs and public impatience for American action in the European theater. Each guy acted nonchalant, but we were fully aware of the long-range strategic planning that hinged on this particular mission. Maybe we didn't know any better, but we had plenty of confidence. Confidence in our weapons, confidence in our buddies and the way they did their job. We didn't think of ourselves as heroes, just hot rocks. But heroes or not, the flying privates, sergeants, and generals were putting their lives on the line, knowing full well what the odds were. At the controls of one of the lead ships was the old man himself, General Aker, flying a B-17 which someone aptly named Yankee Doodle. As the bombers pulled up their gear, American flyers and 12 American machines assembled over the British countryside. ready to test an American idea in France, high-altitude precision bombing. As England disappeared behind us, we took up battle stations. Our bombardiers and gunners knew that the fate of the mission and the lives of the crew depended on them. We took turns manning the guns, expecting opposition. One of the crew pointed out the city of Rouen, where Joan of Arc had died for the liberation of France. Now, airplanes named Baby Doll, Peggy D, and Yankee Doodle were spoiling the fight for the same thing.
German warning centers, caught by surprise, didn't report the fortresses until they were well on their way to the target.
We made a direct run for a point about 3 miles north of Rouen, and then a slight turn to the right for the bombing approach. All of us flying this first U.S. bomber raid wondered why the sky was clear of enemy fighters and flak. Visibility was excellent, something you don't get for night bombing. All 12 planes dropped a total of 37,000 pounds of bombs. Then we met flak. Daylight gave the Jerrys better targets too. They pumped anti-aircraft shells smack up to our altitude. Two of our planes collected some flak. Our group was intact. The mission was far more successful than many of us had dared hope. Even British Bomber Command Air Chief Marshal Harris sent General Acre enthusiastic congratulations. Yankee Doodle, he said, certainly went to town and can stick another well-deserved feather in his cap.
The general hurries to headquarters to report the latest mission a success. And again the crews assemble, this time to give details of their part in the raid. Grim, determined men, helping to smash the Nazi hold upon Europe's enslaved people. Yes, the United States Army Air Force is in the fight to the end.
The B-17 bombers of the 97th Bomb Group all came back from the very first precision daylight bombing mission, although 2 aircraft were damaged. Sometimes, even if a plane did make it home, the battle damage it had received during the mission presented as much danger in landing than it did during the mission. And with the close of the Rouen mission, the first chapters in the legend of the mighty 8th were complete. An Air Force had been born. men had been trained and skilled in combat. State-of-the-art aircraft had been delivered and worked out. Ground support units had been supplied and equipped. Airfields had been built and barracked. And battle tactics tried and tested. The 8th Air Force was ready to take the fight to the enemy over the course of what would turn out to be the next 3 years. All that remained was to get the job done.
The Mighty Eighth was made mighty by the fact that they were never turned back from a mission.
We were hit, the cockpit was hit and almost, you might say, almost exploded, especially on the co-pilot side where you could look out and actually see the engines right out of the open air.
The story of the Mighty Eighth continues in Part 2.